The world is on edge, waiting for Israel's next move. In a few days from now, it will be the first anniversary of the October 7 attack on Israel. Tel Aviv is yet to respond to Iran's missile strikes, even as it continues its offensive against the Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Will there be an all-out Iran versus Israel war? That's the one question the entire world is debating at the moment.
War clouds thicken over West Asia. Just days after Iran's barrage of missiles against Israel, all eyes on Israel's next move. Iran shot off another warning, saying any retaliation by Tel Aviv will trigger a harsher counterattack.
The security of the region is the security of all Muslims, and we do not want any war or bloodshed. Since I assumed the presidency, every speech I have made has emphasized our quest for peace and security. No nation or region can prosper in the midst of war. We were left with no choice but to respond. If Israel decides to retaliate, then it will face harsher reactions.
Israel is ramping up its offensive against Hezbollah. The heart of Lebanon's capital city, Beirut, was bombed on Thursday, damaging multiple buildings. Just near the parliament, plumes of smoke ignited the skyline.
On Wednesday, 8 aerial strikes were carried out at different 8 locations by the IDF, and that continued during the last night, even today morning, when the Hezbollah claimed that one of the rehabilitation units, the people who were helping for the wounded and the affected, has been targeted, in which Islamic Relief Trust staff has got killed.
This is the first time Israeli strikes have hit so close to the seat of governance in Lebanon, signaling a fresh escalation. In southern Lebanon, Israeli forces suffered some casualties even as they took on Hezbollah fighters in close-quarter combat. Israel also bombed a weapons depot in the coastal city of Jabaleh in Syria. Meanwhile, Houthis in Yemen claim to have launched another drone attack at Israel.
In continuation of the victory for the oppression of Palestinian and Lebanese people and in support of Palestinian and Lebanese resistances, the Yemeni armed forces, drone air force carried out a military operation targeting a vital target in Jaffa area, Tel Aviv, in occupied Palestine, using a number of drones. The operation achieved its goals successfully.
The multi-front war is expanding by the hour. Can a bigger war be averted? Bureau Report, India Today.
Hello and welcome. Iran's missile strikes on Israel have brought Iran and Israel closer to the prospect of an all-out regional war in the Middle East than at any point in time over the past 1 year. Countries like the United States, China and India have been advising restraint, but this seems to be having little impact on Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Forces. Joining me now on the news track, live and exclusive from Boston, is a special guest. Allow me to introduce Professor Wali Nasser. Professor Nasser is arguably the world's most renowned expert on Middle East politics and US foreign policy. He specializes in the affairs of his home country, Iran. Professor Nasser is at present a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. His expertise has informed policymakers for decades, from the Obama administration to present-day discussions on Iran's nuclear strategy and regional ambitions. Nasser is the author of several important books, including The Shia Revival and Forces of Fortune, which have shed light on the way sectarianism, geopolitics and economics intersect in shaping the model Middle East. I heard Professor Nasser at the World Economic Forum, and I am delighted that he's taken out time to join us on India Today at a time when the world's eyes are on Iran, Israel, and no one really knows what to expect next. Professor Nasser, welcome to India Today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this program.
Can you begin by explaining to everyone watching you in India and elsewhere what you think is Israel's most likely response to Iran firing more than 200 missiles towards Israeli territory?
That is difficult to say. I think this is not a simple answer for either Israelis or the United States. They have to calibrate what do they expect an Iranian counter-reaction would be. I think the United States is perhaps advising Israel to retaliate in a manner that does not provoke a further retaliation from Iran. And at the same time, also, Israel is busy with wars in both Gaza and Lebanon right now. And although it wants to retaliate against Iran for the missile attack, it does not want to open a third front with Iran at the same time. And so I think that that's why it's taken them a while, that they will have to calibrate and find a way in which that they would give a response that looks sufficiently strong, targeted, but does not provoke an immediate wider war at this stage.
What was the signaling in the missile strikes that Iran directed towards Israel? Given the fact that there were some military targets that were picked, but Israel is claiming success that their missile shields were able to ward off most of the missiles that were coming in. Where does the reality lie? Iran claims we attacked the hangars, we attacked where the F-35 fighter jets were stationed. It's a big success. Israel says no one was killed, nothing really happened.
Well, I think nobody has seen footage of those air bases, so we really don't know. But I think Iran's point was not to kill Israelis, because they also don't want to provoke a larger war. Their point was to say they have the will and the capability to hit Israel. That is important because in the Muslim world, and particularly in the Arab world, it positions Iran as the only country that has the audacity to take Israel on. So it gives them legitimacy, particularly after the death of Hassan Nasrallah. Secondly, I think Iran's aim is to say that enough of its missiles can get through the Iron Dome for Israelis to worry. And I think the target audience here is not the Israeli military, is the Israeli people, who previously thought that the Iron Dome provided 100% protection, but now would have to think that out of 200 missiles, I don't know what the number, but let's say 10% got through, hit their targets, and one of them actually landed in Tel Aviv, not far from the Mossad headquarters, and that if things escalate, that there would be casualties. Yes, not all of the Iranian missiles would get through, but that's not the point, because this was a warning shot, if you would, by Iran. And yes, the Iron Dome works. The Jordanians also shut down some of the missiles, but at the same time, the Iron Dome did not perform 100%. And so I think, you know, the Israelis can claim success, but also I think the Iranians can claim that they got their point through, that they have the will and the ability. That's what they wanted to put forward, not how many people they kill.
In your estimate, are we heading towards a larger military escalation between Israel and Iran? And if, God forbid, there is actually a higher military escalation between these two countries, how is that likely to play out militarily?
I think the two are now heading towards some kind of military confrontation, maybe not immediately, but not in the very long future. They now have emerged, if you would, as the two main great power rivals in the region. The rest of the region is basically bystanders right now. In the most important wars of the region, which is in Gaza and Lebanon right now, these are the two protagonists. And they are also increasingly confronting one another directly. They may not be ready for an all-out war, but unless things change in the Middle East drastically, and the United States is able to redirect the region towards de-escalation, starting with Gaza, that then we're heading somewhere very bad. But at the same time, Israel has tremendous amount of missile and air capability. But given its size and the number of soldiers it has and its current security situation, it's not capable of invading Iran. And at any rate, these two countries don't have borders with each other. So the way in which this war would unfold is with missiles, sabotage, bombing from a distance, cyber attacks, but it ultimately will involve the United States. Because the United States is in the region. It has said that it would defend Israel if it comes under attack. It has stepped up to intercede Iranian missiles as well as Hezbollah missiles in the past. And ultimately, at some level of the war, it may engage Iran directly. And then the war will spread to places like Iraq and the Red Sea elsewhere. And I have to say that the Persian Gulf monarchies, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, are in great danger because not that they will be party to this war, but that the war will be fought in an arena where which could threaten the economic models that they are pursuing. The idea of a corridor from India to the Mediterranean does not really work if it's going through a war zone between the United States and Iran. And largely the idea of Gulf stability, the rise of the Gulf, its tourism, industries, etc., has been backed on a relative peace that we've seen there, which actually has come as a consequence of normalization of relations between UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So a war with Israel threatens all of that. The Gulf economies cannot be bystanders to a war, even if their governments don't participate in it. And one reason for that is that a lot of American military bases are stationed in Gulf countries. And so I don't see a scenario in which that the U.S. would carry out bombing of Iran, for instance, without the bases from which those airplanes came become targets, or the economies where they are hosting those become targets. Already, Iran targeted air bases in Israel that it said were responsible for carrying out the bombing that killed Hassan Nasrallah. So the same kind of a model in the Gulf would mean Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Oman, all of these countries could be targets or at least arenas in which things have that the war would unfold. So that's a worst case scenario, that the war between Iran and Israel will quickly decimate, if you would, the current stability in the Gulf, in Iraq, elsewhere in the region, that on the back of which the economies are built. And then finally, I would say, as this escalates, we talk about where the Arab governments stand, but the Arab people are increasingly more and more on the side of Iran, Hezbollah, and particularly on the side of the Palestinians. And that reality at some point in time may explode in the open as well. We're seeing demonstrations, anger, etc., but at some point in time that would also become material.
A lot is being said about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanting to use this opportunity to take out Iran's nuclear facilities. How likely is that scenario, that the IDF uses these Iranian missile attacks to go and attack Iran's nuclear facilities?
It is not realistic. Iran's nuclear facilities are not like the Oziraq nuclear power plant of Iraq in 1980s, which is sitting above the ground, an easy target. They can hit some sites, but they will not destroy them. And once they do that, then essentially the United States would have to get in the war. And then we are in the scenario that you mentioned. So Israel is in a position to start a war between the United States and Iran, and itself and Iran. But Israel is not in a position to finish the war. Israel is in a position to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, but it's not in a position to destroy Iran's nuclear program. In fact, if such an attack happened, the consequence would be that Iran would take its program deep underground in its mountain ranges in a way that bunker buster bombs cannot destroy them. It would spread them far and wide, farther to the east, and then it would probably come out of the non-proliferation treaty and openly declare itself a nuclear state. So any attack on what is currently, at least officially, seen as civilian nuclear program that Iran holds up for negotiation with the United States, any attack on it would then convert this to a weapons program right away. So the surest way to turn Iran from this ambiguous place it is into an outright nuclear state is to attack this. And then once Iran becomes nuclear, then you have to say Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, the whole region will become nuclear. And that is a non-proliferation nightmare, which above all will threaten Israel. Israel right now is sitting in the middle of a region that is in disagreement with it over its policies in Lebanon and in Gaza and in the West Bank. Even those countries with which it has good relations are opposed to its policies. Does Israel really want to see several Arab countries and Turkey also being nuclear? So it's not a course, it's a course of satisfaction in the short run, but in the longer run, it's a strategic mistake by Israel to push Iran in that direction.
Some Israeli politicians have spoken of how this is a ripe moment to push change, that if Israel makes the right moves because of internal protests and dissent amongst the people in Iran, that this is when they can force regime change. Now, you understand the internal affairs of Iran better than most, and therefore, what's your assessment on this question of whether, because of internal dissent, can Iran be pushed towards a change in regime?
I think that's a very simplistic reading of it, and among the many scenarios of what might happen in Iran, is taking the absolute best one that you can see. I mean, first of all, even those who are opposed to the regime in Iran are not necessarily supporters of Israel. And it's not a given that when they protest at their own government, when their government comes under threat, that they're not, some of them at least, are not going to rally to the flag. So the idea to think of the population of another country as being willing to betray their own government in a moment of war and side with an aggressor, one who they are critical of by and large for his policies in Gaza and Lebanon and don't view as a friend, is largely wishful thinking. And then you have to say that even if the regime in Iran fell, I mean, we saw the United States think like this in 2003. You're assuming that immediately a pro-Western, stable, democratic government is going to come to power, is going to be friends with Israel and America, and is going to basically toe the line. That may very well not be the case. There are many, many other scenarios of the kind that we've seen happen in Lebanon, in Iraq, etc., that would produce much worse nightmares and scenarios. I mean, Israel itself went into Lebanon in 1982 to destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and it ended up creating Hezbollah, a far greater threat to it. And right now, even in Lebanon, it's not in a position, beyond killing Nasrallah and downgrading Hezbollah, to produce anything positive in Lebanon. The United States did the same thing in Iraq. So this is very facile thinking. This is more, I think, public relations thinking that is serious strategic consideration.
You said that Israel can push Iran and the United States into war. God forbid if that were to happen. What's your reading of Iran's military capabilities at this moment, given its economic turmoil and economic sanctions, and how is that war likely to proceed, and would that potentially ultimately involve China and Russia as well?
No, it will not involve China. China does not have a military presence in the region. And Russia, yes, it has capability to support Iran's military, although it's involved in a war on its own. I mean, a war, again, as we're seeing in Ukraine, can go in many directions. I mean, Iran is not going to fight the United States with tanks or the way Saddam Hussein did. It's not going to fight it in a conventional military war. It may hit American targets with missiles, etc. But ultimately, the United States has to consider that it will have to invade Iran. It would have to do what it did in Iraq, in a country that is orders of magnitude larger than Iraq. Its capital city is 2,000 kilometers and 2 mountain ranges away from the nearest port. That if the United States could fail in Iraq, does it really think it's going to succeed in Iran? If it cost it trillions of dollars and so much casualties in a way that it actually impacted its domestic politics, and yet wasn't able to deliver anything in Iraq. If you look at Libya, if you look at these much smaller, easier countries, and military invasion has been a failure and created bigger headaches, what would make the United States think that it would militarily succeed in Iran? I mean, hitting Iran to punish it is one thing, but a war How many American troops would it take to actually invade Iran and occupy Iran? And then the assumption is that the Iranians won't fight in a guerrilla war in a way in which the Iraqis fought. So, once you start talking this language that we're going to go to war, we're going to change things in Iran, yes, it's very easy to say that the Iranian regime is a problem, it's a threat, and you want to get rid of it. But serious people would have to think through multiple steps. And what is your exit strategy? How does this end? None of it looks good with Iran. That's exactly why the United States is not eager on what Israel is actually advocating. Israel may want a military solution to Iran, but it seems to me that the United States is not buying into that right now.
This turmoil is unfolding at a time when the United States is just weeks away from its presidential election. There's talk and a lot of commentary around the October surprise and how this could potentially benefit Republican nominee and past President Donald Trump. Is it your sense as well that in the US elections, the turmoil in Iran and Israel could potentially actually work to Donald Trump's advantage?
Well, it depends on how big it gets. I mean, if you actually have a situation where the United States is becoming involved in war or Americans are being killed, and Americans have to actually consider the possibility of war, I think that advantages Donald Trump over Kamala Harris, largely because of the biases about gender, race, etc., that exist in large parts of the United States. And also because the election is not going to be decided by those who already know who they're going to vote for. It's going to be decided by undecided voters who may go one way or the other based on very, very last-minute things. And this issue is exactly perhaps why Israel feels that it has a vacuum in which it can push much harder, because the Biden administration, fearful of reaction in the elections, is not putting its foot down with Israeli actions. In fact, for instance, it claimed that it didn't even know or approve of Israel's killing of Hassan Nasrallah. And also, Israel does not worry about Donald Trump winning. I mean, it's possible that Prime Minister Netanyahu would actually welcome a Republican administration under Trump. So America's domestic issues at this moment in time are also part of the strategic calculation by both sides.
No, but I want to press you further on this. Given that we're in the middle of an election, given that Kamala Harris in the public comments that we heard from her seemed far more soft on Palestine and far sterner with Israel, pushing harder for a ceasefire, pushing harder for a hostage release and for a cessation of military action, how does that impact her candidature, given how hot button Jewish politics and everything to do with Israel is in the American political context?
Well, American politicians, both Trump and Kamala Harris, express deep support for Israel. So that's not what's going to separate them from one from the other. For a lot of Americans, it's not what they're saying about Israel, it's how they judge a president at a particular point in time to be able to be a commander during a war. If you're in peacetime and war is not on the horizon, you focus on the economy or you focus on varieties of other issues. And it's also possible that the Americans will continue to just vote on the economy or such issues as the right to abortion or those sorts of issues. But if, and that's a big if the war enters into their calculation, if they begin to decide, are we going to go to war, then perhaps, based on historical view, that Donald Trump will be viewed by those undecided voters in the middle, the ones that probably have some Republican leaning, some Democratic leaning, but are neither Democrat nor Republican, that among them, that they may view him as a tougher commander-in-chief. I mean, Kamala Harris is has not been wasn't in the Senate for long, is new to that level of American politics, is a woman, is a minority. You know, there are these prejudices also in American society. And so at least many pundits believe that war does not benefit the Democrats at this point in time. I mean, the Republicans have historically been seen as much tougher on national security issues. Although I have to say, this perception may not be supported by reality, because Donald Trump has an aversion to war. He didn't want to go to war with Iran when he was president. Yes, he killed General Soleimani. He talked tough, but in reality, every time that he came close to going to war with Iran, he backed off. And he has said things during the campaign, which is, you know, I'm happy to be friends with Iran. They can be a great country. They just cannot have nuclear weapons. He hasn't even said they cannot have a nuclear program. He has said they can't have nuclear weapons. You could say this is actually a pretty soft comment if you were sitting and listening to this in Tehran, that he's asking us not to have something we have already said we don't want to get right now. So you know, my sense is that if we stay where we are right now, if this doesn't escalate much further, that the war issue in the Middle East will not be a big concern during voting. But if
speaking of Iranian nuclear weapons, how far is Tehran from having a deliverable nuclear weapon which can be used against Israel or the United States or wherever? What's your best estimate?
They're not near at all. Iran is very near to having enough fissile material for one bomb, but that's only the fuel for it. Making a bomb is a whole different process. Being able to deliver it, because Iran actually doesn't have an air force, so it has to be with missiles, is a whole different process. And then one bomb is not going to give you any protection. You need to have 30, 40 bombs in order to be able to do that. And Iran is many, many years away from that. So yes, it has the technology and the know-how to be able to, within a week or two, get to enough 90% enriched uranium that is good for one bomb, but not beyond that.
So, to what extent has the recent success against the Hamas, against the Hezbollah attacks inside Iran, been able to turn around Benjamin Netanyahu's fortunes? When October the 7th happened last year, you know, his image took a massive beating. There were protests on the streets of Israel for weeks on end against him and his government. People were asking him to step down. He didn't. It seems from the outside that these recent successes have really turned his political fortunes around. His opinion ratings are higher than what they used to be. How does that impact the future of the political creature Benjamin Netanyahu?
I mean, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but my read of it is that it has benefited him. He's emerging as the Churchill of Israel, a wartime prime minister that has stood tough, has fought against enemies that Israeli public is worried about. And now his message to Israelis is that I'm going to restore maximum security back to you, vis-a-vis Hamas, vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and vis-a-vis Iran. I'm going to get rid of these forces that keep you up at night. Now, that's a tall order, but it is one that, for now, it's benefiting him politically within Israel. And that's also important because it means that Prime Minister Netanyahu, for now, has to stick to this course of action. I'm going to totally destroy Hamas, totally destroy Hezbollah at any cost, and then I want to take Iran on as well, and once and for all, finish the security dilemmas that Israel is facing. Now, I don't think this strategy will work in practice, or is not as easy as he makes it, but as a political message to a people that were battered on October 7th, that are highly worried, that are angry and have a feeling of insecurity given what's happening around them and what happened on October 7th, it is a very powerful message. As I said, it's the message that, you know, Churchill ultimately gave to the British people during World War II. So yes, I think it has strengthened him.
Give us a sense of the situation in Iran at this time and the decision-making matrix. There's relatively moderate president, Masoud Pezeshkian. He was attempting some kind of a rapprochement with Iran, which is potentially why Iran didn't retaliate earlier, because there was talk of a ceasefire with the Hezbollah, potentially with Hamas as well. Who calls the shots when a decision to attack Israel is taken? Is it the supreme leader? Is it the Iranian Revolutionary Guards? And how does all of this impact the new Iranian president?
Well, look, ultimate decision has to be made by the most important political figure in the country, which is the supreme leader. But as let's say in India, it would be by the prime minister, who ultimately makes the decision. But there is a national security process. These things are debated. Even within the Revolutionary Guards, there might be different opinions about when to retaliate, how aggressively to retaliate, and what to retaliate with, and what hard targets to hit. And then there are civilians, some of whom are hawkish, some of whom may be more moderate. And it's not a question just of moderation and hawkishness. It's a question of what is the interpretation of what serves Iran's interest. For instance, the Pezeshkian's view, or his foreign policy team's view, is that Iran also has to remain focused on negotiating, improving its economy by having nuclear talks with the United States. And you have to follow a course that protects a diplomatic pathway with the U.S. There might be somebody else, even among the civilians, who said, well, look, the United States is not going to talk to us anyways. They're not going to lift sanctions anyways. And anyways, they would respond better if we stand tough. So there is real debate in Iran about, and you could see that when the head of Hamas was killed in Iran, there was an expectation that Iran would retaliate right away. And at that point in time, the national security process made a decision that this wasn't the right time to do it. At this time, they decided that it is the time to do it. In April, they decided the time to do it. So it's not that simplistic. It's not just that this one man does this. This is a sophisticated country, and with many different power centers who view their interests of Iran differently, at different weight, and also like Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu, they also have their own domestic objectives and agendas as well. And so this plays out, and I think ultimately the supreme leader decides, but he listens, and people lobby, and sometimes you see him to be more hawkish because of that process, and sometimes, like when the killing of Haniya, they decided to not to retaliate at that point in time.
There's so much made of the level of penetration that the Israelis have been able to achieve within the Iranian security establishment and the Revolutionary Guards. When Ismail Haniyeh is killed, when all these attacks happened on the Hezbollah, and the Iranians aren't able to protect their proxies, how does this play out internally? This messaging constantly coming in from Israel that we've been able to penetrate the higher echelons of Iranian security decision making.
Well, Israel has absolute superiority in this. This game of espionage between countries. I mean, take, let's say, India, Pakistan. This is not new to countries. They penetrate each other. They try to gather information. And larger countries like, let's say, India or Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Egypt are perhaps much more vulnerable because of the many points of entry that you have. Countries like Iran or Egypt or any other country cannot reciprocate with Israel as easily. Israel is not as open to being penetrated in the same way. But what we have seen is a level of intelligence penetration, not in Iran per se, but in Lebanon with Hezbollah, that proved to be extremely decisive. So there is no question that the pager attack in Beirut, Israel's ability to eliminate dozens of Hezbollah leaders en masse, one after the other, and then kill Hassan Nasrallah, was a massive intelligence coup, which was a game changer. So there's no question that Israel won a major battle in Beirut, in Lebanon, on the back of intelligence coup, which is, but it actually is a big victory because it erased the negative memory of how they dropped the ball on October 7th on intelligence. where leadership of Mossad and many in the military resigned or were blamed for not seeing the attack coming. So now Israel has turned the tables. It basically, and that's in the calculation in Iran and in Lebanon as well, because they cannot easily move forward in aggression against Israel without actually addressing the intelligence leaks within their own system.
Will Israel invade Lebanon again in a full-fledged fashion? We've seen limited incursions, border operations, special forces in action. Do you think this will ultimately lead to a larger full-fledged ground invasion, or would Israel think that would be too costly and therefore ultimately decide against it?
I think it's being debated in Israel. I mean, a ground invasion involves many things, and we saw yesterday that 8 Israeli commandos were killed in Lebanon, which was a very, very immediate warning to Israeli public, even more so than its government, that yes, aerial bombardment of Beirut and dropping massive bombs to kill Nasrallah is one thing, but actually putting your soldiers in a line of fire is another thing. And it's not like they were killed after you got to Beirut. They were killed literally as soon as they crossed the border. So that this is going to be grueling, you have to be prepared to give that cost. Secondly, invasions are expensive in terms of people and the economy. I mean, if you have to go into a country the size of Lebanon, you have to mobilize a lot more troops. Those troops have to be prepared to be there for a long period of time. That means that they were not going to be working in stores and businesses and companies inside Israel, that the economy will be impacted. And this could be an open-ended war that can take months. I mean, look, invasion of Gaza, its bombing has taken a year, and Gaza is still not done in Israel's eyes. It hasn't completely finished Hamas. And so they have to calculate these things. It's very, very different from intelligence superiority and air and missile superiority, which Israel clearly enjoys. But air and intelligence superiority does not destroy Hezbollah. It weakens it. If Israel's objective is to go in and completely uproot Hezbollah, every single missile, gun, etc. that they have, that's a whole different proposition.
You know, how does this end? Do you see any, in the way that this battle is going at this moment, the prospects for escalation? How long could it go on for, in your best estimate? How could it potentially end?
Well, it can go on for a very long time, and it can get very bloody, and it can be proved very costly to the Middle East. I think, ultimately, it requires the United States to step in. It has to essentially get to a point where what has been the agenda of the United States all along, which is Israel needs to declare victory and accept a ceasefire in Gaza. It needs to, use the killing of Nasrallah and the downgrading of Hezbollah and declare victory. I think you have to start by ending the conflicts that are ongoing right now. We have a number of wars that are happening in and around of Israel after October 7th in Gaza, in Lebanon, and is now spreading to Iran and the Gulf. And the United States has been either unable or unwilling to actually stop these. And if you can't even put a ceasefire in Gaza, it's very difficult to see how this could end well, one way or the other. And so I think the Middle East is entering a very dark phase that could potentially be very damaging. And for countries like India, who are vested economically in the Gulf, in the Middle East, who are neighbors to the Middle East, it doesn't come to their borders, but it will impact some of their interests as well. And same with China, same with Russia. A Middle East that falls into a complete sinkhole is going to be costly to the world as a whole. Unless you stop it, you stop the current corrosion and the current destruction, and then once you stop it, you can think about how you could move forward. But
Professor Nasser, you're speaking of the role the United States needs to play in this war. What about the role of China? Because the Saudis and the Iranians were brought on the same table by Beijing. So where do you see the role of China in this current conflict?
Well, no, the Chinese do not have leverage of that kind with any country in the region. or with Israel in particular. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia wanted to make a deal. They needed China as a broker that both sides trusted. And so the Chinese could actually play that role because the two countries were willing. The Chinese did not force the Iranians and the Saudis to come to an agreement despite themselves. I mean, ultimately, you can play this role. The United States can play this role because it has so much military hardware in the region. So it has deterrence capability with Iran, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, Houthis, Shia militias. It has also enormous amount of leverage with Israel. So it's the one country that, as it has done in the past, that can actually force a settlement on the region. Rather than if both Iranians and Israelis were willing to come to the table and just needed a place to meet, yes, they could meet in Moscow, they could meet in Beijing, or they could meet in Europe. But I think, you know, if you looked at other wars in the Middle East, you know, the United States played a decisive role in when the war ends, and where do you stop the region from sinking into a complete collapse. And I think that's the only way in which I think this bleeding in the region stops. Otherwise, this region is now at a place where all the red lines of the past are being crossed. And there is nothing in it that you would say by itself will stop, unless you would think that Tehran and Jerusalem would, in their own mind, somehow come to a conclusion that they need to stop on their own. But that's not the case right now.
I've learned a lot in the course of this conversation. Professor Wali Nasser, for taking out time when you're being pressed for comments and reactions by people across the world and joining us on India Today and speaking to our audience. Thank you very much for illuminating us with the depth of your insights and your genius. Thank you very much, Professor Wali Nasser.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.